You have the unknown on the very outside, and then inside that you have culture. It's like, and so that's like nature and culture as well. It's like unknown territory and known territory, and then inside the culture, holding you up, so to speak, is the individual. And you might say, well, why in this representation is the individual crucified? And the answer to that is quite straightforward. Life is mostly suffering. And there's more to it, though, than that. The other element, too, and this is part of the complex representational system that underlies the symbolic representation of the individuals. The individual is also something that can die and be reborn. And that symbolic representation already showed you in the figure of Jonah, right? Because the idea was there that some terrible thing swallowed this creature up, pulled it down into the depths, and then let it reemerge. And I would say that's happened to you people many times already, even though you probably don't know it. So think back on your experience. So let's lay out a couple of things that everybody knows about. Someone close to you died. Someone close to you got a serious illness. You got a serious illness. You were completely heartbroken because a relationship failed catastrophically. You were betrayed by a friend. Well, I'm sure that for most of you, at least, well, let's find out. How many people in this room have had at least one of those things happen to them? Right. So, okay, so you perfectly well understand what those experiences are like. So then the question is, where do you go when an experience like that occurs? And you might think, well, what do you mean, where do you go? You're in the same place. And I would say to you, well, no, it depends pretty much on exactly what you mean by place. Places are times too, and you can be one person at one moment in the same place and a completely different person in the next moment in the same place. And that means you're really not in the same place at all. And when something comes along and pulls the rug out from underneath you and you fall, what you fall into is the unknown. And that's a completely different place. And that's the underworld of classical mythology. And it's also the unconscious. And part of the reason that it's the unconscious, it's so complicated. When the rug is pulled out from underneath you, and you're somewhere you don't want to be and didn't expect and didn't like, what starts to structure how you respond is the fundamental biological systems that make up the substrata of your psyche. So, for example, the first thing that might occur is that you experience it as a terrible shock. And that's a physiological response. And then maybe right afterwards you're angry, or you're afraid, or you're confused, or you're depressed, or it's another emotional response. And then you start to imagine alternative scenarios or reasons why this thing might have occurred. There's a whole set of processes that are automatically undertaken when you encounter something that's outside the realm of your expectation and your desire. And if you understand that, and this is why I've told you all these complicated things today, if you understand that that's a different place, and that you cycle through that place and then back up to normal reality, and through that place and then back up to normal reality, multiple times throughout your life, you can see that, one, it's inevitable that the individual is something that suffers. Two, the individual is something that can suffer and then reconstitute itself as a consequence of that suffering. It doesn't necessarily happen, Now and then, something can come along and take you off at the knees and you just never get back up. But the general human experience is that you learn as a consequence of your failures. And the reason for that is that the place that you go when you fail has a tremendous amount of information in it. So, for example, it might be that if you were betrayed in a relationship, that you're just too damn naive. And there's a lot of things that you should have paid attention to in the world, and maybe even within the person who you were attracted to with regards to their character, or your own character, that you should have known more about. And if you would have known more about it, well, that would have been a particular hole you wouldn't have stepped in. And so the appropriate reaction to a catastrophic failure, and this isn't always possible, is to react as how you're going to react, which is usually with shock and dismay. And then to learn from the experience and to gather whatever information there is in the failure so that you can extract out that information and rebuild yourself out of it and restructure your conception of the world so it's richer and more dynamic. Now, let me just give you an example of that. Remember the Hobbit, right? I don't know, spent a couple of $100 million on that movie, and it was written in the 1960s, but it was based on very, very old stories, including some of the Norse sagas. Remember the Hobbit at the beginning. I think we established that was Bilbo, right? So he lives in this little area called the Shire that's really protected. And he's kind of a little guy, and all the people in the Shire are kind of naive. It turns out in the Lord of the Rings that they're actually protected. There's these people called Striders that walk around the border who happen to be the sons of ancient kings who keep all the bad guys away, and the bloody hobbits don't even know it, and they're even kind of contemptuous of the Striders. But they're keeping these hobbits so that they can be naive and self-satisfied and somewhat ignorant and, a bit on the arrogant side without even knowing that they're being protected. Okay, well that's you. That's why you were hooked into the story right off the bat. And then they extract out one guy from this whole scenario who's, got a little bit more going for him than the typical hobbit, and he wants to go outside of this paradise, so to speak, to encounter the actual world. And it's so interesting because what's his role? What do they hire him as? A thief. Yeah, you think, geez, this is pretty weird. This guy's going on this developmental quest. He's going to turn into a hero. And what does he start by doing? He starts by becoming a criminal, right? But that seems to be part of the story. It's actually part of his heroic transformation. And, one of the things Jung said about heroic transformations was that the first thing that happens when you put yourself outside your zone of comfort, if you do that voluntarily, is that you encounter your shadow, which is the part of you that is fundamentally, in some sense, antisocial and criminal. And then you extract from that element of yourself those personality attributes you need to survive when you're outside where everything is comfortable and predictable. And then what happens with Bilbo? Well, he encounters a dragon, right? That's the dragon we talked about already. That's the thing that swallows you up when you don't know where you are. And he gets a treasure as a consequence of that. Well, you see, what the story means is that if you go outside your zone of comfort, if you go outside of what you understand and you do that voluntarily, and you develop the skills that you've rejected that are necessary for your proper survival as an integrated human being, you can encounter the thing that most frightens you, and you can extract something of value as a consequence. And that's the human story. That's the fundamental story of mankind, because we're always the thing that goes outside of what we understand to confront what we don't understand that frightens us so that we can get whatever that thing has. Go somewhere you don't understand. That's the first thing. Get thee out of thy country. Back in the 1920s, there was a whole slew of American writers who ended up as expatriates in Paris, Hemingway among them, and who wrote The Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald, yes, and a variety of others. It was very inexpensive in Paris at the time, and part of their transformation into great literary figures was the fact that they were out of their country, and now they could see what their country was, because you can't see what your country is until you leave it. So you have to go into the unknown, and that's God's first command. Go into the unknown, because you already know what you know. And that's not enough unless you think you're enough. And if you're not enough and you don't think you're enough, then you have to go where you haven't been. And so that's the first commandment to Abraham. It's like, okay, that's a good one. That makes perfect sense. Go to where you don't know. Yes. And from thy kindred. Well, what does that mean? It means grow up, right? That's what it means. It means get away from your family enough so that you can establish your independence. And that isn't because there's something wrong with your family, although perhaps there is, as there is perhaps wrong with you. But it means get away. I talk to people very frequently whose families have provided them with too much protection. And they know it themselves, and that means they're deprived of necessity. One of the things that you see in the United States, for example, is that the children of first-generation immigrants often do better than their children. And the reason for that is that the children of first-generation immigrants have necessity driving them. And you don't know how much you need necessity to drive you, because maybe you're not very disciplined. And if a catastrophe doesn't immediately befall you if you don't act forthrightly today, then maybe you never act forthrightly, right? Because the gap between your foolishness and the punishment is lengthened by your unearned wealth. And so you never grow up and learn, and you have to get yourself away from your dependency in order to allow necessity to drive you forward. And so you get away from your country, and you get away from your kin and from your father's house, right? And you go out there and you establish yourself in the world. It's a call to adventure. That's what the first lines in the Abrahamic story is, a call to adventure.